Hello and welcome to this new podcast. You've been a guest before. Hi, Utkarsh. Welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you.
This particular series that I'm doing is called The Other Side of. So, this is more about checking what happens to us when we are dealing on a daily basis in our professional lives vis-a-vis values. But it's a free-flowing conversation. Like last time, there is no agenda to it except finding out what happens when we go through our varied experiences and how we use those experiences to enhance or to figure out what our value systems are. That's more or less what I've been trying to do with the series. Um, you are the first banker on the show, so I'm glad. I do not know what I'm going to ask you, but let's try. So, the first question that is coming to mind, bankers are about facts and figures. Um, Preferably, they would not want to get into imaginative places or notions about something. They would want some figures or facts that can be backed up. How does dealing with something like this impact your daily life?
I think it definitely makes you a very data-driven person, so very like looking at the facts when it comes to, making decisions in your life, passing science, like all these things. Like it makes you look very closely at what's kind of going on under the hood, pretty much, because it's again very easy for the data to mislead and very easy for people to manipulate it to tell a story that they're trying to tell. So I think it generally makes me very skeptical, actually, when I read anything, which I think is a good thing. Not believing anything on face value, kind of doing your own homework, verifying, everything that comes your way. But I'd also just push back against that it's all facts and figures. I think there is a strong case for value judgments to be made, and a lot of the times, the data you're dealing with isn't clear cut. A lot of the times, things you do is more of an art than a science. So it's definitely not as clear cut as maybe some people perceive it. But yeah, I'll leave it there. I'll let you.
Okay. Does it make you a dry person or does it make you balanced according to you? By dry, I mean a lot of people are driven by emotions most of the time because your work involves dealing with a lot of data and you are skeptical. Um, at the same time, you need to cross check because a lot rides on banks all over the world. So, how does that affect your personality per se, according to you?
I mean, I'd like to think it doesn't make me a dry person, but I think that's up to the individual, because everything you do is going to shape you in some way. And it's kind of up, the onus is on the individual to try and balance that out in other ways. But it's also not, again, I think generally data will get a very like bad rap of like, oh, you're just spending your time looking at numbers and in spreadsheets and things like that. But I think what people forget is that the other side of those numbers are still very real things and very real people. So you could be looking at the data, oh, unemployment increased by 0.2%. That's not just a number that's increasing by 0.2%. In India, in somewhere, that's 100,000 families that now don't have an income. So I think humanizing what you're doing is extremely important, because just because it looks like boring banker stuff on the outside or whatever, like at the end of the day, this is all trying to get at what's grounded in reality. And if you're doing policy, which is what I do, it's fundamentally at the end of the day, trying to make the lives of people better. And again, if you're trying to make the lives of people better, that's a value judgment in what counts as better and what counts as worse. So again, that's kind of the point I was making before, that it's not just black and white data-driven stuff. You still fundamentally have to make value judgments at like the baseline level. But then again, the second part of that is, even when you're just looking at the data, these aren't numbers, these are people. I think that's an important thing to keep in mind. So in a sense, if not, it doesn't make me dry. If anything, it makes me more of a humanist because I think, more
Yeah,
cognizant of what's
okay.
behind the numbers.
Yeah, that's a very beautiful point you made. Um, so, okay, one question about, since this sounds very important. If you understand what you just said in the depth that you mentioned, uh, I think you also understand that every decision you take, everything that you do with the work that you do, is not one more thing that you're going to the job and just finishing your stuff and feeling good and taking your salary at the end of the day. It is impacting lives out there. So it has got to be done with the utmost integrity and precision as much as possible. Every decision has to be valued for all the pros and cons before you come to it. Um, how do you, what is it that makes you decide on something when you're working? Suppose there's any important project or any information that comes to you regarding a project, sometimes which seems very important. Um, like one of the things that I have to do sometimes with my work is quote industry figures on what is happening in that particular industry at that point of time. What I try and do is when I put a figure, I try and understand what the figure means because a lot of time it is gobbledygook. You're like trying to figure out what it is. So unless I really understand it, I don't put it there. I have to understand the entire context. So for example, a statistic is mentioned that, say, to continue your example, 42% increase in people getting out of jobs. 42% since when? Which are the number of years that they are comparing? What are the areas they are looking at? I try and see that I have a holistic view rather than just the percentage, which seems very dramatic. So what is it that you do at your end on a daily basis? If you can give me a value system of, okay, this is how I approach every subject, that would help.
Um, I think giving a full, as a holistic answer is a bit difficult because it, a lot of the time is case by case basis.
Yeah,
But I think to your point, it is a lot about being kind of intellectually honest with what you're presenting, not trying to, because again, it is extremely easy to lie with data and statistics. So making sure you've done the due diligence, just try and get the whole picture. Again, it's very easy to cherry pick a few data points to make the story that you're trying to tell. People do that all the time, and that's fine. But again, at the end of the day, I think, again, it depends on what motivates you, of course. But if you're trying to get to some notion of truth, to actually figure out what's going on a deeper level, you need to look, at the holistic thing, look at multiple data points. And to your point as well, again, you could read some study of like, oh, X, eating some food increases your risk of cancer by 1,000%. Okay, that's fine. But what was the base? If my original base chance of getting cancer was extremely low, 1,000% increase from a very low base, it's still very low. So like a distinction between percentage and percentage points. Now that's a subtlety that a lot of people don't appreciate. But again, that's just one of many different ways people can lie with statistics. And if you're not used to dealing with data on a day-to-day basis, you're just going to hear that and be like, oh, geez, 1,000's a lot. I should probably stop eating this thing. But again, that's the level of, I guess, the skepticism that I was talking to you about, the critical thinking and passing kind of everything that comes your way, because it's very easy to be deceived. I think on a more practical level, maybe to answer your question, again, it sounds like you already mentioned it, but again, you spend a lot of time in the weeds, like you're looking at the methodology documents of how certain things were made. You're reading footnotes, you're reading what's on page 176, what they don't want you to see, to really understand what's going on so you can convince yourself as to what this number actually means.
so interestingly, one of the thoughts that hit me was I was having a discussion with somebody who's in the communication industry, films, basically films. And I was trying to tell him that one of the things that I faced when I joined advertising was the high level of intellectual stimulation that I got. And when you come back home, life cannot be the same there. Like home is home, and you're doing what seems like drudgery when you're young. Especially when you are in advertising, there's a lot of hectic deadlines, and you're working with the fastest thinking people as far as you're concerned, and you're competing. You want to do the best, and you want to come up with something which is clever. You want to be respected for seen as a professional who can deliver in the most adverse kind of situations. Now, this kind of drama doesn't happen at home. Definitely not on a daily basis. So you come back home and there is this whole disconnect with the situation at home where you're trying to figure out, okay, when I was younger, I had a lot of problems with this because my friends and family and other relatives used to talk about stuff that seemed like inconsequential. What are you talking about? Um, so in your case, when you're looking at data, you're cross-checking and you have a skeptical bent of mind, you're trying to figure out how to get it so that you reach a level of truth that you are comfortable with, so that you can present it and back it up with whatever you studied so far. You may have friends, you may have other people that you are in connection with who people are very casual sometimes when they talk about things, and their jobs may not be as intense or as important to the society at that point of time in the way that yours is. It might be just general accounting or any kind of other job like sportsmen or anything else. Now, if they are your friends and they are being casual about something, does that also affect your personality when you're with them? Does it also like seem uh, hard to connect sometimes? Or is there any such issue that arises?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I'd push back on this notion that some jobs are less consequential than
Yeah.
others. Like I appreciate, like I understand where you're coming from, but at the end of the
By
day, it's
consequential, maybe a wrong term. I mean, in terms of intense pressure that
sure,
one faces.
sure. Yeah, I mean, there's a time and place for like everything, right? Like I think it's important to be able to kind of detach from what you do in your 9 to 5 when you are sitting and having coffee on Saturday morning. Like there's a time, and this is when when people are workaholics, it's hard for them to detach this. They can only talk about work. They're spending so
Yeah,
much time there. They're working really hard. Again, find it intellectually stimulating, care about what they do, but that's all they talk about. Now, you don't really want to be friends with somebody who can only talk about work, right? And this goes back to your being balanced point. I think, yeah, maybe when I was younger, it I think it definitely was tough to kind of sit down and maybe just talk about what seemed like frivolous stuff. Now, that's not to say that I wanted to talk about work specifically, but I think I was at this point where I was like realizing how
yeah,
big the world is and how many problems there are and how you can go so deep into so many things. So when it came to talking to people and they weren't thinking about these things, now that doesn't need to not necessarily be work, but philosophy, like anything, literally
yeah,
anything.
yeah,
It was frustrating. It was like, okay, there's so much out here, and the fact that you're just content having a few beers here on a Saturday night and we're not thinking about anything else was frustrating. But I think as I've progressed, I've realized and appreciated that, again, being able to just sit and have a few beers is very not that is an extremely valuable thing. Like you don't want that to go away. You need friends and people that you can do that with, right? Not every conversation needs to be thinking about how to solve the world's problems or the meaning of life. Like sometimes it's nice to just sit and enjoy each other's company and just be happy with each other. But again, this is the challenge of the individual to be able to balance both, because either extreme I don't think is good. So it's being able to ride the line. And I think I've also found that most people do have these deeper thoughts. They are thinking about these questions. They might just not be thinking about them in the way you are used to dealing with them, right? And if you do try and engage with them and meet them where they are, or talk about things they're interested in, you realize they've actually got a lot more deep thoughts of, are thinking a lot more deeply about things than you perhaps initially gave them credit for. So I think a lot of it is on the person itself to try and draw these things out from the other person they're having a conversation with, if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's a very interesting point of view. Also, one of the things that came to me is also the timing. You may be the same person, but on that particular day, at that particular time, you may not want to indulge this kind of discussion. You may want to just let things be and enjoy yourself for whatever it is worth. So even if the
Exactly.
person is the same, not all people are going to connect on the same topic at the same time, always perhaps. Um, you did mention that it is more of an art rather than a science, what you're doing right now. Um, the art lies in what aspect of your job?
Yeah, I think like
Can
just
you elaborate?
sure. Yeah, I think just generally any job that is perceived as cold hard facts, numbers, there's a lot more art than science in it as a whole. So not just what I do, but it comes from, for example, you're trying to answer a question and you know theoretically what the perfect data set looks like. Okay, to answer what was the impact of this policy on how many people had jobs, right? You know, perfect, like ideally what you would like for that data to look like. But in reality, that's not what it's going to look like. So in trying to use what's available to match with like your idealistic view, there's a lot of judgments and there's a lot of art from getting what you have to where you want to go. Right. Now that's not to say that it's all completely made up and that all value judgments are equal there, because they're not, because some are going to be better than others. But there's a degree of creativity involved in that, from getting from where you are to where you want to be.
How much does intuition play a part in this?
I think a decent amount. But again, intuition is also one of these like tricky things to bed down, because it's not just some God-given thing. You've got intuition or you don't. You develop intuition through years of work, right? So what looks like spooky intuition of some grandmaster chess player isn't just from the hand of God. It's because they've played hundreds and thousands of games over their life and they've embedded the game into their head in such a way that looks mysterious to the outside observer, but it's something that's been trained. So I think the answer to your question is, I think a lot, but it's definitely something that can be developed.
Okay. Considering that banking industry all over the world is has seen a lot of challenges in recent times. In the Indian scenario specifically, the kind of loans given and the bad debts that have happened, and big timers have, for whatever their reasons, have not been able to repay their loans. And with this kind of pressure on an industry, I do not know whether this same thing is true worldwide, but at least one thing that I've understood is banking is a very important part of all businesses, considering that at any given point of time there is something or the other you've got to do with the bank, whether you're a small businessman or a large one. So my question basically is there any stress as far as the importance of your job is concerned as a whole, not your job in particular, as an industry?
Like, is there like a pressure on the day to day
Yeah.
that I
Do you think of that at all? Does it exist or it doesn't?
I mean, I'm not thinking about it every second of every day, but I'm definitely aware of, but again, this is true of most jobs, right? Like, you're not thinking about the importance of the job, but if you stop doing it, this is a serious problem. Now, a plumber isn't thinking that, oh, if I don't turn up to work today, the whole country's sewage system is going to stop, but it will, right? Now, is that motivating them to get out of bed in the morning? Is that motivating them in their next project? I don't know. But it's still it's still a consideration. So same thing with me again. It's like that's not maybe what's driving me to get to lunch or to get to the end of the day, but in maybe moments of reflection, you're like, no, this is important work, but as is a lot of stuff, right? And if again, just, I guess why the jobs exist. If you're not doing them, something will break. So yeah, I think about it, but probably not as often as I could.
Um, Another question that is running in my mind is again something to do with numbers. Uh, there is a certain sanctity or a sense of integrity to numbers. They, while presented in the data form, they are definitely malleable and sometimes may cause a huge amount of disruption. Uh, but numbers by themselves are quite clinical. Uh, does that help you be more clear in your thinking in daily life as well, working with numbers?
Yeah, I think I think you hinted at this distinction as well, but it's like the distinction between like the maths of it, which is all very internally consistent. It's clear. There's no ambiguity there. And then when you bring it to real life, and then you're actually dealing with data that might be imperfect and things like that. But I think your question is more related to the first one, and I think it definitely sharpens your thinking and aids logical thinking and internal consistency. Now, whether that's always a good thing in real life and living as a human being is an open question, because a lot of the times what's required when a friend is asking for advice or telling you about their problems isn't the logical analytical solution. It's just providing a listening ear and understanding that it's emotions that are driving these things and not reason. So it's not always helpful, but if you know when to dial it up and dial it down, I think it can be.
Okay. Um, has there been a distinctive change since you started working uh, with these kind of aspects, that you started understanding yourself more, what you stand for, what are the challenges that the job comes up with? Because it can't be always uh, as linear as you're making it out to be. You're coming to the job, you're thinking of policy, and you've worked, you've done your due diligence, you come up with data that is relevant, and you presented it, and people are loving it, and then suddenly you're a star. It doesn't work like that. There are a lot of other things that come into the picture. Sometimes people are knowingly corrupt. And when I say knowingly corrupt, because not necessarily that they want to be corrupt, but because they want to be, uh, they're biased with a certain point of view. Like in data, whatever little bit of work that I have had to do at some point of time, I have realized that starting with a certain presumption, one is either predisposed towards it or against it right from the beginning. And then you find data that backs you up like that. How do you see this?
So to the first point, I think just going through like a process like this again, being lucky enough to work in places that make policy, I am extremely sympathetic towards policymakers now. Like you can like anything, governments just like policies during COVID or what, like you can pick anything. It is such a hard job, like such a hard job, and you're never going to make everybody happy. And I'm extremely, extremely sympathetic, especially when it's something like COVID. You've got to make decisions fast in the fog of war. You've got no idea what this thing is. Whatever you do is almost certainly going to be wrong. You're just trying to be as less wrong as you possibly can, right? So I think it's just very easy for us to sit on our couch and criticize policies. Again, this is not to say that there aren't stupid mistakes being made and that everybody's doing the perfect thing. But I'm definitely convinced enough that people are trying and they're trying their best. And I think just generally as a society, we could be a little kinder towards the people that are trying. And that's not just with policy, but that's with everything. To your second point of people looking for confirmation of their beliefs, yeah, again, we kind of talked about this before of being intellectually honest. And again, this comes, yeah, I think it's important to not just look for, again, data points that are confirming your beliefs, because that's just your confirmation bias, but you've got to be looking for data points that are going to falsify what you think. Again, what I think, again, asking that question of what do I need to see here for me to change my mind? If you can't answer that question, you're not really being intellectually honest. You're probably being a bit dogmatic with the views that you hold. But if you have a belief about the economy or whatever it is, I think you need to be able to answer, what do I need to see for me to change my mind? And then make efforts to try and find that so you can be, again, sure of the views that you're holding.
I think that's a very good suggestion across all fields of endeavor, not only yours. If one were to, relook at their predispositions about any kind of decision that they're doing vis-a-vis their jobs. Your first example also reminded me of a movie called Sardar, in which Sardar Vallabhbhai Patel is talking to either the Nehru or either Nehru or the camera. He says, "I do not know if people will judge us kindly for the decisions we are taking in these times, because he was the home minister and those were times of partition. So he went through some of the most challenging times our nation had seen, at least in recent times." It's very interesting. Now that you brought this up, the subject of empathy and kindness. Does empathy and kindness sometimes uh, make you want to lie with numbers or something just because you really want people? Say, for example, COVID, let's go back there. If, say, uh, 10 million people have been affected adversely and many of them have died, you cannot throw out the number at the public. And yet you owe the truth to the public and you just take a number which sounds like, okay, go out with and at least make people think that, okay, there is a chance, rather than giving them bouts of anxiety and stress. Do you think kindness and empathy plays a part in the job that you do sometimes? And
I don't think there's ever a justification to lie with the numbers, even if you're well-intentioned, right? Because that's a very slippery slope. And then your intentions are no different to somebody else's that you might not agree with. I don't think there's a justification to twist for that reason, right? Because that's just a utilitarian argument. And then you've got, oh, I can open the door to lying and doing all these other sorts of things because I'm trying to promote the greater good because I care about everybody's well-being. And yeah, I don't think that's a door you really want to open.
yeah,
But to your point of, like, again, presenting data to change people's minds, and if you're communicating to the public, data doesn't change people's minds, like, period. You could tell somebody that 10 million, 50 million, 100 million people have died of this thing. The emotional registry, like, nothing is going to change inside them. But you tell them one salient story of a friend that experienced COVID, and all of a sudden they're going to believe in it, or they're going to think that this is something worth doing something about, right? So you can tell people there's 300 million people starving on the other side of the world right now. That's not going to do anything to them. But you tell them one salient story, and that's going to spur some action. So yeah, in terms of, like, changing data to change people's minds, especially, like, communicating to the public, to be honest, I don't think it really does much.
um, it's good that you use the word intention here, because one's intention may differ from somebody else's intention at that point of time. I want to understand, how do you value intention as a core value when you are approaching your professional life and your personal life? If there are separate answers, I'm okay to listen to them. Or if you think there is only one answer, I'm okay with that as well.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think intention definitely matters, like 100. There's no question about that in my mind, especially in a personal sense. Right now, like, just a trivial example of whether somebody intentionally trips you, accidentally trips you, completely changes your perception of that social interaction, right? So there's no question intentions matter, but they're often not enough, at least on the personal sense. Now, you could have every intention to be somewhere on time or do something. It's nice that you wanted to do that, but you didn't. And it does matter, the outcomes as well. So they both matter. Now, on the professional side, it's a bit more of an open question in my mind. Again, still matters, but how much value I place on it, I don't know. Because again, at the end of the day, if you have X job, the job needs to be done, the job is important. Do I really, again, does it matter how invested the person doing that job is, as long as the job gets done properly? Now, you could argue that you can't do the job properly without the right intention. And again, I have sympathy for that. But there's definitely things you can do where you just need to get them done. It doesn't matter what the person feels about it. And that's okay too, right? Like it's a bit, I feel like the work sphere feels a little bit more consequentialist than the personal sphere. But again, it's a balance, right? If I'm a therapist, my intention probably matters a little bit more because it will bleed into the way I deal with clients. Maybe not if I'm just, a binary, again, just a banker, I don't know. So I think, yeah, it matters in both, but less in the work front.
There are a lot of people who would misuse that statement that you made and say that, okay, if the end justifies the means, then it's okay. My intent is to get a good result for my organization. Okay, I'll give you an example that had happened. There's a very big company in India. My friend was working for them, and they had to. I think this was the time of when all of Mumbai was flooded. I'm not sure if that was the day, but one of those days where things were quite bad, and I was out on some work. And this friend called me and he said, okay, why don't you come and help us create something, some communication saying that they were in some kind of providers of electricity, if I'm not mistaken. And their network was down for the last, whatever, a day and a half or whatever. And they wanted some communication that people were angry and they wanted to calm them down. And we had come up with some kind of communication. I wasn't working with them, but as a friend, and me and another friend, we went and we resolved their problem. And when the time came for me to bill them, that guy refused to pick up my call. And now the reason why I'm bringing this up is there is a certain sense of professional understanding that if I'm involving somebody like an Utkarsh who's got so many years in the field, he comes with a certain kind of competence and can deliver on a small notice in terms of time. How do you view professional ethics as important vis-a-vis in India? The reason why I also bring this up, in India we always, or rather still, use personal connections to get some professional output very often, and I do this very often for a lot of friends who I'm just kind to. I don't even bother about, but sometimes it's on a bigger level. And how do you see this intermix of personal and professional life? I don't know if you've had any exposure like that in the countries that you've been in, or do you have a point of view on that?
Yeah, I'm not sure I got a good answer for you on this one, but there is a lot of professions that will try and like formalize an ethic of behavior in their professionals, like even like the Hippocratic Oath. Right now, I'm not sure there's many doctors that are willingly going around thinking I want to do harm to my patients, but and most of them will be willing to help. Where you take this oath and it kind of puts you into this identity of a doctor that has certain, norms of behavior and duties towards the people you're around, which might not align with your personal norms. But now you've taken the oath, you've got to do the thing, right? Whether you like it or not, because that's kind of part and parcel of the job, right? But then there's other professions which won't formalize it so strictly, right? And then it's a bit more of the personal ethics that comes into it. And I'm, again, to be honest, skeptical, I think, of any sort of like professional ethics trying to like, oh, this is the way you have to behave in this, like in this organization, because it's like, at the end of the day, the individual still has to like decide to uphold that. And again, then you can try and, develop incentives to be like, well, if you don't uphold this, then we'll take away your license or do whatever else. So then you're trying to like manufacture incentives to like make people behave in certain ways, which again, I think is fine. But it is because you think that people's personal behaviors aren't going to align with what you want them to do. So you bring in all of these incentives. Now, again, that's not always a good thing, because bringing in external incentives can crowd out your internal motivations. So maybe you're just happy to help somebody, right? Maybe you'll give up a seat on the train if somebody asks you, but if somebody offered you money to give up your seat, you're not going to do that. Now you think there's no difference. You're just going to be on net better off with the money than without. But something about that incentive makes you not want to do the thing, right? So I think a similar issue might arise in a work front where, okay, maybe I'm just happy to behave in an ethical way or do my job nicely. But then if you start putting these incentives around me, then I'll be like, hang on. Then I start thinking in terms of cost and benefit and be like, well, this isn't actually worth my time. I'm just going to do the bad thing. Where if that wasn't the case, you would have just done the good thing anyway. But again, this is again case by case. It's a tricky one, and again, I'm not sure I have a good holistic view on that.
No, I think that's a interesting answer, considering that it has several points of view covered in it. To each his own, more or less, seems to be a this came from that it becomes easier to deal with people whose ethical understanding are the same most of the time. Although that is very idealistic point of view, it doesn't always happen. But off late I'm realizing that a kind and an empathetic point of view is far more important sometimes, because people have they may have certain problems that they think that this is a solution. They are not necessarily corrupt. They think this is a solution. It's a easy going thing. It doesn't really hurt anyone. So this happens sometimes. Thank you so much for your answers and your time. I think we've had a wonderful conversation. A lot to mull over. It was good having you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. This was fun.
Bye.
Bye.